There are men who fear violence. There are men who fear failure. And then there are men who fear something far more revealing: silence. Not because silence is dangerous in itself, but because silence removes the protection of noise. It strips away performance. It exposes the nervous machinery hidden beneath personality. Most people will never admit this. They will tell you they enjoy peace. They will speak about calm, meditation, inner balance. They will praise stillness while surrounding themselves with distraction. Their rooms speak louder than their words, a screen glowing in the dark. Music filling empty spaces, endless conversations that say nothing, constant motion designed not to move forward, but to avoid standing still long enough to hear what waits underneath. Silence has a peculiar effect on human beings. It does not attack. It does not accuse. It simply remains, and that is precisely why it unsettles weak men. Because silence behaves like a mirror that cannot be negotiated with. Most fears can be managed through illusion. A man afraid of rejection may hide behind arrogance. A man afraid of inadequacy may collect achievements and call them identity. A man afraid of insignificance may surround himself with followers, applause or status. But silence offers no audience and no escape route. It does not care about reputation. It cannot be impressed by confidence. It watches every mask collapse with the same indifferent patience. This is why some men cannot remain alone with themselves. Observe them carefully. The moment quiet appears, discomfort begins. Their fingers move toward a device almost mechanically. Their mouths search for conversation. Their minds demand stimulation, not because stimulation is necessary, but because emptiness feels dangerous. And danger in this case is not external. It is internal. Long before philosophers wrote about the architecture of power, human beings understood one primitive truth. Survival depends not only on strength, but on maintaining a stable image of oneself. The mind protects this image with remarkable aggression. It edits memory. It excuses weakness. It reshapes motives until self-interest appears moral and fear appears reasonable. Most people are not lying to others first. They are lying to themselves. This deception is not accidental. It is protective. A man who sees himself clearly may discover things he would rather not know. He may find envy disguised as justice, cowardice disguised as caution, dependency disguised as loyalty, desire for control disguised as love. Such discoveries are rarely welcomed. Silence threatens this arrangement. Noise protects identity, because noise provides interruption. Silence provides confrontation, and confrontation, especially internal confrontation, is intolerable to many. This is where the observation, associated with Friedrich Nietzsche, becomes uncomfortable. Not because Nietzsche spoke gently about humanity, but because he removed sentimental explanations and looked directly at the struggle underneath social behavior. He understood something that polite society prefers to deny. Human beings are not governed primarily by truth. They are governed by preservation. Not merely physical preservation, but psychological preservation. A fragile self-image fights for survival with the same desperation as a starving animal. This explains many strange behaviors that people mistakenly attribute to personality alone. Why do some men speak constantly, even when they have little to say? Why do they interrupt silence with opinions that were never requested? Why do they fill rooms with words that evaporate seconds later? It is tempting to interpret this as confidence. Often it is the opposite. Speech can be a shield. Not all talking comes from certainty. Much of it comes from anxiety. The anxious mind fears gaps because gaps create exposure. Silence allows observation, and observation creates vulnerability. A man who dominates every conversation often believes he is controlling the room. Sometimes he is merely preventing scrutiny. If attention remains fixed on his words, perhaps no one notices the uncertainty beneath them. If sound continues uninterrupted, perhaps uncomfortable truths remain buried. Weakness rarely presents itself openly. Third, hides inside strategies. This is important to understand. Weakness is not the absence of physical strength. It is not poverty, introversion, or softness of voice. Weakness is dependence. Dependence on approval. Dependence on distraction. Dependence on validation strong enough to stabilize a fragile interior. And fragile interiors fear silence, because silence removes external support. Nietzsche observed that many people do not seek truth. They seek relief. Truth is often painful. Relief is immediate. Noise provides relief. Silence offers neither comfort nor entertainment. It asks questions without speaking. Who are you when performance ends? What remains when admiration disappears? Would your convictions survive isolation? Or are they borrowed from the crowd surrounding you? These questions rarely arrive as language. They arrive as tension, a subtle restlessness, a feeling that something should be happening. Notice how quickly people attempt to escape this sensation. A quiet room becomes unbearable after minutes. A pause in conversation feels awkward. Solitude is described as loneliness, even when no suffering is present. The language itself reveals the fear. Loneliness and solitude are treated as identical, though they are profoundly different experiences. Loneliness is hunger, solitude is exposure, and exposure frightens those who rely on external reflection to know who they are. This dependence begins early. The child learns quickly that approval is safety. Smiles reward acceptable behavior. Disapproval threatens belonging. Gradually, identity forms around reaction. This process is natural, but for many it never ends. The child survives inside the adult, still bargaining, still performing, still measuring worth through the eyes of others. The world rewards this performance more than people realize. Society praises visibility. It rewards constant expression. It admires confidence, even artificial confidence. Silence, by contrast, creates suspicion. A quiet man unsettles people, not always because he is dangerous, but because he interrupts familiar social patterns. Most interaction depends on mutual reassurance. People exchange predictable signals to maintain comfort. They reveal fragments of themselves while carefully concealing others. The ritual is subtle but persistent. I see you, you see me. We confirm each other's roles. Silence interferes with this transaction. A silent person cannot be easily categorized. His thoughts remain inaccessible. His approval uncertain. His motives undefined. And uncertainty creates tension. This explains an old social instinct. People often mistrust those they cannot read, not because unreadable people are guilty of anything, but because ambiguity disrupts control. Control is deeply connected to emotional safety. Human beings relax around predictability. They prefer patterns they understand, even unpleasant ones over uncertainty they cannot map. The silent man becomes difficult precisely because he offers fewer patterns. Weak men experience this as threat, not necessarily conscious threat. Something more primitive. If they cannot read him, they cannot manage him. If they cannot predict him, they cannot position themselves above him. So they attempt to break the silence. Observe this carefully, and you will see it everywhere. The unnecessary joke, the intrusive question, the pressure to explain, the strange urgency demanding participation. Speak, react, reveal yourself. The demand often appears harmless, but underneath lies discomfort. Silence shifts power, not through magic, through asymmetry. The one who speaks first exposes more. The one who explains more reveals more. And revelation creates leverage. This is why interrogation relies on silence more than aggression. People imagine pressure comes from shouting. Often it comes from waiting. The mind dislikes unresolved space. It rushes to fill emptiness. It volunteers information merely to escape tension. Silence does not force confession. It invites it. And weak men, unable to tolerate uncertainty, frequently confess more than intended. Nietzsche understood power in psychological terms. Long before modern language attempted to categorize such dynamics, he did not romanticize weakness, nor did he condemn it sentimentally. He observed, "An observation can feel cruel when stripped of comforting illusions." He saw resentment where others saw virtue. He saw hidden motives beneath public morality. He saw that many social values emerge not from strength, but from adaptation. This becomes particularly uncomfortable when applied to silence, because silence reveals hierarchy. Not social hierarchy alone, inner hierarchy, the hierarchy within a man himself. Who governs his mind? Impulse or discipline? Fear or composure? Need or restraint? The answer becomes visible when nothing distracts him. Weak men do not fear silence because silence harms them. They fear it because silence reveals dependency, and dependency is difficult to disguise when no noise remains. There is another reason silence provokes fear. A darker reason: silence interrupts self-deception. Most people maintain an internal narrative, carefully designed to protect identity. They tell themselves stories about motives, relationships, ambitions, and moral character. These stories are rarely entirely false, but they are often edited. An edited reality feels safer than truth. A man may claim he seeks justice while secretly seeking revenge. He may claim love while seeking possession. He may speak of loyalty while fearing abandonment. The mind protects these contradictions through distraction. As long as movement continues, examination can be postponed. Silence postpones nothing. This is why nights become difficult for certain people. Daylight contains structure, responsibilities, social, performance, activity, but night introduces stillness. And stillness allows suppressed material to rise. Regret, shame, envy, unfinished conflict, buried fear, things ignored during daylight return with remarkable persistence. The world grows quiet, and suddenly the self becomes audible. Many men fear this encounter more than they fear failure itself, because failure wounds pride, but self-recognition wounds identity, and identity resists injury with fierce determination. So the escape mechanisms continue. Entertainment, compulsion, conversation without meaning, movement without direction, noise mistaken for life. The modern world makes this avoidance effortless, perhaps too effortless. For the first time in history, a human being can flee inward, confrontation indefinitely, while appearing socially functional. He can remain stimulated every waking hour, connected yet isolated, informed yet unchanged, occupied yet internally hollow. And because this condition is widespread, it appears normal. But normality has never been reliable evidence of health. Sometimes entire cultures organize themselves around avoidance. Sometimes societies fear silence collectively. And when that happens, noise becomes more than habit. It becomes protection. The dangerous part is not that weak men fear silence. Fear itself is ordinary. The dangerous part is what fear produces. And fear, when hidden, rarely stays passive. It seeks control. It seeks dominance over whatever threatens exposure. Silence threatens exposure, so weak men often become hostile toward it. Not openly, subtly. They ridicule quiet people, interpret reserve as arrogance, pressure others to explain themselves, demand emotional display, treat restraint as defect. What appears social is often psychological defense, because silence does something unbearable. It creates uncertainty about status, and uncertainty unsettles those whose confidence depends on constant reinforcement. The uncomfortable truth is this: many people do not hate silence. They hate what silence prevents them from hiding. And that realization changes how human behavior begins to look. Because once you understand this, conversation no longer sounds the same. Neither does laughter. Neither does confidence. You begin noticing how often sound is not expression, but camouflage, and camouflage always protects something afraid of being seen. The hostility toward silence is rarely direct. Weakness seldom announces itself with honesty. It arrives disguised as concern, sociability, or harmless curiosity. It learns to wear respectable clothing. This is why many forms of control appear innocent at first glance. They do not resemble domination in the theatrical sense. They resemble normal interaction. A man sits quietly in a room. Almost immediately, someone asks what is wrong. The question appears compassionate. Often it is not. Notice the assumption hidden beneath it. Silence must indicate disturbance. Silence must be explained. Silence must justify its existence. This reaction reveals something revealing about human nature. People are generally comfortable with behavior they can interpret through familiar frameworks. But silence resists interpretation. It creates informational absence, and absence unsettles the mind. The mind prefers certainty, even false certainty, over ambiguity. This is not weakness alone. It is human instinct. But instinct left undisciplined becomes dependence, and dependence shapes social behavior more than morality does. A man who requires constant reassurance from his environment gradually loses tolerance for uncertainty. He develops psychological hunger, not hunger for truth, but for emotional stabilization. Approval, attention, reaction, conversation, these become subtle forms of nourishment. Silence interrupts supply, and interruption feels threatening. This is why certain people speak not to communicate, but to regulate themselves. Their words function less as language and more as emotional scaffolding. If silence enters the room, the structure begins to shake. So they fill it. Rapid speech, constant commentary, compulsive storytelling, opinions delivered with suspicious urgency. What appears expressive may be defensive. Nietzsche understood that human beings frequently transform need into virtue. They decorate necessity with moral language until dependency resembles principle. The fearful become cautious. The envious become righteous. The dependent become compassionate. And the weak become loud, not always in volume. Sometimes in presence. Some men dominate social space through endless explanation. Others through performative certainty. Others through emotional spectacle. The method changes. The motive often remains similar. Preservation. The preservation of a self that cannot stand unsupported. Silence threatens such selves because silence contains no applause. No confirmation. No rescue. Only proximity to oneself. And proximity is difficult when the self has been constructed around external reflection. There is a strange paradox hidden here. The men most desperate to be noticed often fear being truly seen. Attention and exposure are not the same thing. Attention can be controlled. Exposure cannot. This distinction explains much of modern behavior. A man may publicly reveal countless details about his life while concealing everything essential. He displays preferences, achievements, grievances, desires, but never uncertainty. Never contradiction. Never the fracture beneath the surface. This is not openness. It is choreography. A carefully managed version of exposure designed to create connection without surrendering control. Silence threatens choreography because silence observes before it participates. And observation creates asymmetry. The silent person gathers information while revealing little. His reactions are limited. His intentions remain unclear. He becomes difficult to manipulate precisely because manipulation depends on data. This makes many people uneasy, not because silence is hostile, but because silence reduces predictability. And predictable people are easier to manage. Most social interaction contains hidden negotiations of status and influence. People rarely acknowledge this openly because power prefers invisibility. Overt domination invites resistance. Subtle influence passes unnoticed. Observe ordinary conversations. Who interrupts? Who seeks validation? Who explains excessively? Who rushes to fill pauses? Who becomes uncomfortable when attention shifts away? These are not trivial habits. They reveal internal conditions. The man unable to tolerate conversational silence often exposes more than he intends. His discomfort becomes visible through excess, excessive speech, excessive agreement, excessive humor, excessive certainty. Excess is rarely strength. Strength economizes. Weakness overcompensates. This does not mean silence alone makes a man powerful. That misunderstanding creates its own illusion. There are silent men who are merely fearful. Silent men hiding insecurity. Silent men withdrawing not from discipline, but from inability. Silence itself is neutral. What matters is the condition beneath it. A disciplined silence differs from a frightened silence. One contains restraint. The other contains paralysis. Nietzsche would have recognized this distinction immediately. He distrusted appearances. He looked beneath performance toward motive. And motive is where human reality becomes uncomfortable. Many men mistake loudness for strength because strength is difficult to recognize when it lacks display. Display attracts attention. Power often avoids it. The strongest presence in a room is not always the most visible. Sometimes it is the least reactive. Reaction is revealing. Reaction exposes pressure points. A man who reacts predictably becomes readable. And readability invites manipulation. This is why silence unsettles weak men beyond mere discomfort. Silence interrupts their ability to map another person. A reactive individual is easy to position. Praise him and he softens. Insult him and he erupts. Ignore him and he pursues. Predictability creates leverage, but silence complicates this process. A man who speaks little and reacts slowly becomes difficult to measure. His emotional landscape remains partially concealed, and concealed terrain creates uncertainty. Weak men interpret this uncertainty as threat because their sense of safety depends on knowing where they stand. Status anxiety hides beneath much social behavior. People monitor invisible hierarchies constantly. Who receives attention? Who commands respect? Who influences the emotional atmosphere? Who appears secure? This monitoring is often unconscious. but it shapes behavior with remarkable force. Silence disrupts hierarchy, because silence refuses immediate participation in these negotiations. It neither competes openly nor submits clearly. It waits, and waiting alters power. There is an old discomfort people feel around composed individuals, not because composure is inherently intimidating, but because composure resists emotional contagion. Most groups function through shared emotional rhythms. Excitement spreads, fear spreads, outrage spreads, anxiety spreads. Human beings synchronize instinctively. This synchronization creates belonging, but it also creates vulnerability. A man governed entirely by collective emotion becomes predictable, and predictable emotions are among the easiest forces to manipulate. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Crowds are rarely governed through logic alone. They are governed through emotional management, fear, urgency, identity, resentment, hope. These currents move people more effectively than reason. Nietzsche understood the power of collective emotion and regarded it with suspicion. Not because emotion itself is weakness, but because emotional dependence invites control. The individual who cannot stand apart from the crowd eventually becomes its instrument. Silence creates distance from collective momentum, not physical distance, psychological distance, and psychological distance allows observation. Observation is dangerous, not to truth, to manipulation. A person observing quietly often notices what enthusiasm conceals: contradictions, hidden incentives, performative morality, shifting loyalties. This is one reason weak men distrust silence in groups. The silent observer threatens social illusion. Not through accusation, through presence. His restraint creates discomfort because it denies easy validation. People seek reflection from others constantly. Approval confirms identity. Agreement confirms belonging. The silent observer provides neither immediately, and absence of confirmation feels strangely exposing. This is why people frequently pressure quiet individuals to disclose opinions. Speak. Take a side. Declare allegiance. The request sounds democratic. Often it is psychological. Ambiguity creates tension. People want reassurance that silent observation is not concealed judgment. And concealed judgment is precisely what many fear. Not because they are guilty of wrongdoing, but because insecurity imagines scrutiny everywhere. Weak men frequently accuse others of arrogance when confronted with restraint. This accusation deserves examination. Why is silence so often interpreted as superiority? Because insecure minds personalize ambiguity. When motives remain unclear, projection begins. A man uncertain about his own worth may interpret reserve as rejection. He assumes the quiet person feels superior because inferiority already exists within him. Projection is among the mind's most elegant defense mechanisms. It relocates discomfort outward. Instead of confronting insecurity internally, the mind attributes hostile meaning externally. He thinks he is better than us. He must be judging. He is distant, cold, arrogant. These conclusions may reveal more about the observer than the observed. Silence becomes a screen onto which fear projects itself, and fear is creative. This is why accusations toward quiet people often contradict one another. Too proud, too secretive, too weak, too calculating. The judgments shift because the source is not evidence. The source is discomfort. Nietzsche recognized resentment as one of the most misunderstood forces in human behavior. Resentment rarely appears honest. It disguises itself, and perhaps nowhere is this disguise more common than in attitudes toward strength. Weak men often resent what they secretly envy, not because they consciously admire it, but because it exposes absence. Composure exposes impulsiveness. Discipline exposes indulgence. Self-possession exposes dependency. And silence, when grounded in inner stability, exposes noise. This exposure breeds hostility. Again, not always openly, subtly. A quiet man may become target of mockery, pressure, social testing. People interrupt him more frequently, demand participation, attempt to provoke reaction. These behaviors are rarely random. They are measurements. The group is asking an unspoken question. Can you be moved? Can you be pulled into our emotional rhythm? Can we access your pressure points? If the answer is yes, hierarchy stabilizes. If the answer is unclear, discomfort remains. and discomfort often escalates into pressure. Weak men particularly struggle with unresolved uncertainty because uncertainty feels like loss of control. Control matters more to fragile people than strong ones. This sounds paradoxical, but strength tolerates ambiguity more easily than weakness does. The secure mind can wait. The insecure mind demands resolution. Immediately. This demand reveals itself everywhere. Instant opinions, instant outrage, instant intimacy, instant certainty. Patience has become increasingly rare because patience requires internal stability, and stability cannot be borrowed from constant stimulation. Silence therefore becomes a test, not a performance. A test. What emerges when nothing distracts you? Who governs your impulses? Can you remain present without immediate gratification? Can you tolerate ambiguity without panic? Can you observe without rushing toward conclusion? Most people underestimate the severity of these questions because modern life rewards speed more than depth, reaction more than reflection, expression more than understanding. The result is peculiar. People become increasingly communicative while understanding themselves less. They reveal more and know less, speak more and observe less. The machinery of distraction grows louder while self-knowledge becomes increasingly rare. Nietzsche feared not silence but unconscious living, a life governed by inherited assumptions, collective pressure and unexamined motives. And unconscious people fear silence for a simple reason. Silence interrupts hypnosis, not mystical hypnosis, social hypnosis, the passive absorption of values, desires, and identities never consciously chosen. Most people inherit themselves. They inherit opinions, ambitions, fears, definitions of success, definitions of failure. They call this identity. Silence introduces dangerous questions. Who taught you to want these things? Who benefits from your obedience? Would your values survive solitude? Or do they require witnesses to feel real? Such questions are destabilizing, not because they destroy identity, but because they expose its construction. Hand-constructed identities are fragile when never examined. Weak men fear this examination, not from stupidity, from instinct. Instinct protects continuity, but continuity and truth are not always allies. There are moments when silence becomes unbearable, precisely because something false begins to loosen. A relationship maintained through dependency, a belief maintained through repetition, a self-image maintained through performance. The mind senses instability and immediately seeks escape. Noise returns, distraction resumes. The confrontation is postponed, but postponed truths do not disappear. They wait, and what waits long enough often grows stronger in darkness. This is why silence acquires power, not supernatural power, diagnostic power. It reveals. And revelation has always frightened those invested in concealment. There is a reason noise spreads so easily among men who have never learned to govern themselves. Noise creates alliance without requiring understanding. A crowd does not need wisdom to move together. It needs only rhythm, shared outrage, shared excitement, shared fear. Human beings often mistake this synchronization for connection. But connection built entirely on emotional momentum is fragile. It survives only while the atmosphere remains intact. Silence threatens atmosphere. An atmosphere is where many weak men build their confidence. Observe how quickly certainty grows inside groups. An opinion repeated enough times begins to resemble conviction. A belief surrounded by approval acquires artificial strength. Individuals who hesitate alone suddenly speak with authority when protected by numbers. This transformation is ancient. The crowd offers something seductive, borrowed courage. Borrowed courage feels powerful because it removes responsibility. A man no longer stands behind his judgment alone. He dissolves into collective emotion. And once dissolved, he becomes difficult to distinguish from the movement surrounding him. The danger is subtle. A man who borrows courage eventually forgets how to create his own. This is why weakness often hides behind moral certainty, not morality itself. Certainty, the absolute confidence that requires no reflection and tolerates no silence. Reflection is threatening because reflection introduces complexity. It reveals contradiction. It exposes motives mixed with fear, pride, resentment, and self-interest. Silence creates space for this complexity to emerge. Weak men prefer simpler landscapes, heroes and enemies, loyalty and betrayal, good and evil. Such categories provide emotional comfort. Reality rarely cooperates. Human motives are rarely pure. Power especially refuses purity. Nietzsche understood this with uncomfortable clarity. He observed that much of what people publicly condemn, they secretly desire under different circumstances. The condemned impulse does not disappear. It merely changes language. This is why moral language often conceals power struggles. A man may condemn dominance while craving influence, condemn vanity while craving admiration, condemn control while quietly manipulating those around him. The contradiction survives because self-knowledge remains shallow, and shallow self-knowledge depends on noise. Noise protects contradiction by preventing sustained examination. Silence removes protection. This is why silence often feels heavier than conflict. Conflict externalizes tension. Silence internalizes it, and internal tension cannot be blamed so easily on others. There are men who constantly search for enemies because enemies simplify identity. If something feels wrong inside, responsibility becomes unbearable. Far easier to locate fault externally. A rival, society, betrayal, misfortune, someone to accuse. Weakness prefers accusation over examination. Examination risks accountability. And accountability is difficult when identity depends upon innocence. This does not mean people invent all suffering. Life contains real injustice, real cruelty, real misfortune. But suffering and self-deception often coexist. Pain does not automatically produce clarity. Sometimes it produces resentment. And resentment possesses strange intelligence. It remembers wounds with obsessive precision, while avoiding the weaknesses that allowed those wounds to define identity. Nietzsche regarded resentment not as simple anger but as prolonged psychological captivity. The resentful man remains chained to what injured him. He speaks constantly of enemies because enemies sustain his internal structure. Without opposition, he faces a terrifying possibility. Perhaps the prison survived longer than the wound itself. Silence threatens this arrangement. Because silence asks dangerous questions, resentment cannot easily answer. Who would you be without your grievance? What remains when blame loses its usefulness? Have your enemies truly controlled your life, or have you organized yourself around them? These questions provoke hostility because they threaten identity, disguised as suffering. Many men fear silence not because silence is empty, but because silence begins dismantling stories they depend upon. And stories are powerful, not because they are false, because they organize perception. Man who believes himself powerless begins noticing only evidence confirming weakness. A man convinced he is misunderstood may unconsciously provoke rejection to preserve familiar identity. The mind protects narrative with astonishing loyalty. Weak men often become prisoners of narratives that excuse inertia. The world is unfair. People cannot be trusted. Nothing changes. Everyone is against me. These stories provide emotional shelter. Shelter has its uses, but live inside shelter too long and it becomes confinement. Silence becomes dangerous because silence notices repetition. The same complaints, the same excuses, the same emotional loops disguised as personality. And once repetition becomes visible, something uncomfortable emerges. Perhaps destiny was not entirely responsible. Perhaps fear played a larger role than pride allows. This realization is difficult because weakness rarely appears dramatic. People imagine weakness as collapse. More often, weakness is accommodation, the gradual surrender of responsibility, the quiet preference for comfort over confrontation, the avoidance of difficult truths until avoidance becomes identity. Weakness adapts. It learns sophisticated language. It quotes principles. It performs sincerity. And because it often appears civilized, people fail to recognize it within themselves. There is a particular kind of man Nietzsche would have observed carefully. The man who confuses sensitivity with fragility. He reacts intensely to everything around him and interprets reaction as depth. Every disagreement wounds him. Every criticism feels personal. Every discomfort becomes evidence of hostility. He calls this authenticity. But authenticity without discipline is merely exposure. And exposure without control creates vulnerability. Others can shape. Manipulation becomes possible wherever emotional reactions remain predictable. This is why self-mastery mattered. Not as spiritual decoration, not as moral performance, as survival. A man unable to govern his emotional impulses does not truly possess himself. His environment possesses him. Praise moves him. Insult moves him. Fear moves him. Approval moves him. His direction changes according to external pressure. Such a man may appear free while living entirely through reaction. Weak men fear silence because silence reveals how little control they possess over their own interior world. The discovery is humiliating. Sit alone long enough and the evidence appears. Restlessness, compulsion, the mind demanding stimulation. Thoughts pulling attention in every direction. Old conversations replaying endlessly. Imagined arguments. Imagined victories. Imagined revenge. The undisciplined mind behaves less like a ruler and more like territory under occupation. Most people do not notice this because they rarely remain still enough to observe it. Movement conceals fragmentation. Silence exposes it. This is why many seek domination over others before achieving sovereignty over themselves. Control outward, chaos inward. It is easier to manage another person's perception than one's own contradictions. Easier to influence behavior than confront fear. And so power becomes distorted. Not power rooted in self-possession, power rooted in compensation. Compensatory power always carries desperation beneath it. The man obsessed with status often fears insignificance. The man obsessed with obedience often fears irrelevance. The man obsessed with appearing strong often fears exposure. This desperation leaks through behavior. Excessive aggression, constant self-advertisement, compulsive need to win every interaction. Such men mistake intimidation for authority. But intimidation depends on reaction. Authority does not. This distinction matters. Intimidation demands attention. Authority remains intact without demanding anything. Silence belongs more naturally to authority than to intimidation. Not theatrical silence, not calculated mystery, simply the absence of compulsion, the absence of psychological hunger. A man who has learned to remain silent without discomfort possesses something increasingly rare, not superiority, independence. Independence from immediate validation, independence from constant explanation, independence from emotional urgency. This independence unsettles weak men because dependency recognizes freedom instinctively, and what cannot be controlled is often feared. This fear explains why silence attracts projection and hostility. The quiet man becomes a canvas. People assign motives to him, invent narratives, assume judgment, assume arrogance, assume weakness. Their imagination fills the informational vacuum, but projection reveals more about the projector than the target. The quiet man becomes threatening not because of what he says, but because of what others hear inside themselves while standing near him. Silence amplifies interior noise, and many men spend their lives fleeing precisely that sound. Perhaps this is the final discomfort Nietzsche forces into view. Weakness does not merely fear strength, it fears responsibility for its own condition. Because responsibility eliminates refuge, the moment a man recognizes his participation in his own psychological captivity, excuses lose their protective function. That moment feels brutal, not liberating. Brutal, because illusions often survive for years, sometimes decades. They become companions. They organize relationships, ambitions, even identity itself. Silence threatens these companions, not through violence, through patience. It waits long enough for pretense to become difficult, long enough for contradiction to grow visible, long enough for a man to encounter himself without witnesses. And this encounter explains everything. Why some men fear quiet rooms, why they flood life with stimulation, why they demand reaction from others, why they mistake noise for confidence and movement for meaning. The fear was never truly about silence. Silence was merely the setting. What they feared was the possibility waiting inside it. The possibility that beneath performance, beneath borrowed certainty, beneath social masks and practiced identities, there remained a stranger they had avoided for years. And perhaps this is the cold realization hidden beneath everything said before. Most men do not fear being alone. They fear being alone with the person they have become. Because silence does not create weakness. It reveals it. And what is revealed in silence was already there long before the room grew quiet.